Hello and welcome to RADTV live at 5:25 on CCTV, Chittenden County Channel 17, Centre for Media and Democracy and Town Meeting Television. If you've not seen us before, RAD stands for Rights and Democracy. We are a grassroots, people-powered organisation committed to creating an independent political movement for long-lasting fundamental change in Vermont and New Hampshire. You can call into this show anytime you like and ask our wonderful guests a question. Our number is 802-262-3966. And if you like what you hear this evening and you'd like to know a bit more about RAD, you can always find us online at radvt.org or radnh.org. And if you really like us, then you can also make a donation there as well. So thank you for watching the show this evening. I'm your host, Tom Proctor. And tonight's topic is slavery, reparations, and the profits of legalized cannabis. So, slavery in Vermont, how and why is this relevant 220 years after slavery has claimed to have ended in the Green Mountain State? We'll also be discussing Bill H478, an act to look at making a task force to establish if Vermont should apologize for slavery and whether reparations need to be paid. And finally, tying this all together, we'll be discussing the legalization of cannabis, how drug laws have historically targeted minorities, and whether or not we should funnel profits or taxes from the industry into rectifying this historic injustice. We have two guests with us this evening. First of all, we've got State Representative of Chittenden County, Brian Chena. And we've got the Burlington Police Chief, Brandon Del Pozo. If you'd like to introduce yourself, that'd be fantastic.
Okay. So my name's Brian Chena. I'm a state representative for Burlington. I represent Chittenden 6-4, which is a piece of the Old North End and most of the East District of the city of Burlington. I have been a state representative since 2017. I was elected in the election of November 2016. Before that, I was a school commissioner for the Old North End. My profession is that I'm a social worker. I have a private practice in clinical social work in downtown Burlington, and I focus mostly on treating trauma in children and families. I'm also a part-time employee of the Howard Center for the Mental Health Crisis Service, and I'm a performance artist. So those are some of the things I do besides being a state representative.
I'm Brandon Del Pozo, again, the Chief of Police. Thanks for having me here. Chief of Police of Burlington. I've been in that job since September of 2015. I'm retired from the New York City Police Department. I'm a native of Brooklyn. Brian had a long list of interests that he does besides his work. Sometimes I feel like my work is all I do. But I love the outdoors. So when I have some time, I do skiing, cycling, ice climbing, rock climbing, you name it. And just by way of full disclosure, Brian and I went to college together many years ago. So there may be a conspiracy afoot.
It's a fun fact. I did not know that. Which college was it?
Dartmouth College.
Oh, okay. Yeah, a big pause there.
We might have to post this on like some alumni webpage. They could troll us.
Thanks for the warning. State Representative Chena, let's start with you. Currently is a campaign to remove all references of slavery in Vermont state constitution. Tell me a bit about this campaign and why removing these references is so important.
Sure. So maybe I should start with last year. Last year I was approached by Mark Hughes from Justice for All, who informed me that, when he read the Vermont Constitution a little closer, that technically slavery was still allowed in Vermont. And I quickly looked at Article 1 of the state constitution, and indeed, it says that slavery is prohibited except, and it proceeds to outline how you can keep slaves of people of certain ages, as well as people who've committed crimes or have debt. And I had concerns about this, so I had a resolution drafted in which the majority of the House signed on to as co-sponsors, urging the Senate this year to start the process to amend the Vermont Constitution to remove those references to slavery, or to amend it in a way that it was clear slavery was prohibited in Vermont. And we didn't act on that resolution because we were assured that the Senate would take action this year. So this year, the Senate did create Proposition 2, which amends the Constitution. And I'm happy to report that today, Proposition 2 was given second reading in the House of Representatives and sent to the Government Operations Committee. So what that means is that the Senate passed that proposal. And so now what will happen is the House will take testimony and the House can bring it to the floor. And if the House passes it this year, it has to pass again 2 more times. I believe in the next biennium it has to pass. And then it goes to the voters for a vote. So we are on the path to amending the Constitution to make it clear that slavery is not legal in any form in Vermont. And I believe you asked, why is this important? Mm-hmm. So the reason this is important is that the Constitution is the foundation of our law. And if we allow any form of slavery in the very foundation of our law, then that could potentially be used to defend injustice in our law. And if we want to unroot systemic racism from our society, then we have to do it at every level, including the Constitution. You could think about it as if you think of our society as a house. You know, if there's problems based in the foundation affecting the whole structure of the house, you can keep fixing all the crooked doors and floors and leaks and issues throughout the house. But if you do not fix the foundation, you're going to keep having problems.
And Chief Del Pozo, how do you think the language that Brian has highlighted from the Vermont Constitution with regards to slavery still affects Vermont today?
So interestingly, I was in Montgomery, Alabama a few weeks ago, and I was at the it's the Museum of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is the memorial that tackles the American practice of lynching, right, of Black Americans. There's also a slavery museum there, and they talked about how even in Alabama to this day, the language of slavery is in is in their state constitution. And the other thing that was really striking and very moving is, although there was not a known and documented instance of lynching in Vermont, which is something I think that we can be proud of. It's not, I will qualify that. It's that type of frankly, of racial terrorism is still in the legacy and in the lineage of Black America. And it's hard as a police officer coming from a different perspective with a different color skin to understand why Black Americans are just afraid of the police, just as a matter of normal interaction sometimes. But when you really take seriously the legacy that we have of participating as cops in lynchings and participating in acts of bias and violence based on race, you could see why even like if you're a Black American in your 70s or 80s, if you're a grandparent, you were alive in a time of active lynchings and killings, of summary executions of Black Americans. And it has to be reckoned with, and it has to be rooted out, and it has to be acknowledged. And it's not just in practice, it's in, like, as Brian so eloquently said, in the very foundation of our laws. So I think that it's part of this, to answer your question, having laid that down, it's a very comprehensive approach that we need to take, not only in how police treat people and how we act as free of bias as we possibly can and look to root out the last vestiges, but also in the very foundations of our state and our nation. We have to be clear about the right language and the right commitments, and it's all part of that.
Do you think having this sort of language in the Constitution in Vermont, even though it's somewhat forgotten, affects the way that law enforcement treats minorities in Burlington and Vermont in general?
I mean, I don't think that there are Black Americans or Vermont cops who are poring over the state constitution and pointing out its language and taking license. But I have to tell you, like, if you're coming out of a legacy of slavery and lynching and segregation, and you look at your own state constitution, or even here that it has caveats that provide for slavery, like you have the right to wonder, how seriously is the state's commitment to my liberty and my freedom and my rights? And so I'll say the path from that language to disparities in policing is not exactly clear, but we can't deny that these huge disparities exist. And I think that, we'd be remiss to not take advantage of the opportunity to get our values right in our state constitution.
Brian, you recently introduced Bill H478, a bill to establish a task force to study and consider a state apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery. What do reparations mean to you?
Well, it's not an easy thing to answer. If you look at the definition of reparations, there's different definitions that are connected. We looked this up recently in the dictionary online. I don't remember exactly which dictionary, so I can't cite the exact one, but it said that the first definition said that reparations were like a direct compensation for harm caused, and the second definition said that they were some effort made to repair harm. And I see it as some combination of these things. When in H.4 78, what we're doing is we're asking for a task force to be formed with the mission of taking account of what actually happened in Vermont from the formation of the Republic of Vermont until today in terms of slavery and its connection to systemic racism. And we're asking for a state-sanctioned investigation into our history, sort of a clearing of the record, getting things set straight, and then determining should there be an apology offered by the state for the harm that was caused by the institution of slavery and the systemic racism that followed, and are any reparations in order? How do we make amends as a society? I do not want to sort of speculate what the task force would recommend or try to influence that. But what I would say is that I think reparations could play out on a wide spectrum of possible options, ranging from, direct compensation of individuals whose wealth could be traced back to slavery on one end, and on the other end, reallocation of our society's resources to change systemic racism, as well as recommendations about policy and law that needs to be changed to right the wrongs. There are people out there saying that we are trying to erase history or rewrite history by changing the Constitution, and what I would say to that is the Constitution is not a museum. The Constitution is a living document. I know there's some people who argue about that, but it is a living document that's supposed to reflect the foundation of our current law. And by amending the Constitution, what we're saying is that we are clarifying what we want the root or the foundation of our current law to be. And then the idea of this task force, in conjunction with that work, is to say, moving forward, how do we own what happened, set the record straight, make a plan to address that harm, and then as a society, we can truly move on. But when dealing with trauma, if a person doesn't put trauma in its place and kind of make meaning of their trauma, they perpetually relive their trauma. And that's just me speaking from my therapist lens, but we can apply it to societal level trauma, that if we don't make meaning of what happened and put it in its place and move forward, we're doomed to repeat it.
And this study, or this bill to establish a task force to create a study, has got groundswell across the country, and not just here in Vermont. But it's based on a bill that was introduced many years ago. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and why you're seeing more of a groundswell for this sort of task force today? Yeah,
well, there has been efforts in the United States on a national level to look at reparations for slavery for a long time. And I don't want to get into the details of that without reviewing my history books, because I don't want to get the years and the names of people wrong. But I acknowledge that what we are doing is part of a movement that goes back many years. I would speculate that the reason right now, I did not expect there to be this level of national attention when we were working on this. It just so happens that as we were working on this and introducing it, presidential candidates started talking about it again. And so now there is this this national discussion. And I would actually attribute it to the shift in racial consciousness that has been happening since September 11th. I think there's the civil rights movement goes back to the very beginning of slavery in the United States, and so we could really dig into it and look at all the waves. But I see this as part of a wave that began in the 21st century, because we saw sort of the zeitgeist in America shift after September 11th, and from that, you had the Bush presidency followed by Obama, and when Obama became president, there was a racial backlash to having the first black president. And from that racial backlash, we saw a shift in racial consciousness that then led to a greater spotlight on some of the continued problems with systemic racism. Specifically, I'm thinking, like the school to prison pipeline, police enforcement practices, and the criminal justice system issues. And then we had Black Lives Matter rise up and really bring this issue front and center. And so I think all of that is part of what is contributing to the current interest in reparations.
Thank you. Chief Del Pozo, Vermont has the highest rate of adult black male incarceration in the country, and it is widely acknowledged that the war on drugs has targeted minorities and the economically disadvantaged. Moving on to the legalization of cannabis, what is the Burlington Police Department doing to rectify this previous injustice?
No, that's a great question. And as we know, cannabis became legalized in Vermont last July. And what you'll see is, first of all, even well before then, very, very few Vermonters were arrested by the Burlington police for, smoking a joint or having a bit of cannabis on them. More people were arrested for possessing larger quantities, for selling it. And when you break down the incentives in the black market and you realize and just acknowledge that black market incentives correspond to poverty and opportunity or lack thereof, you'd see that Americans of color, which have had much less opportunity and suffer under greater burdens and poverty, are more likely to be incentivized by the black market. So you kind of alluded to that, right? And I'm bringing it back around that when we're making drug sale cases, they're disproportionately made against people of color. So just as a plain fact, number one, legalizing cannabis has reduced the number of motorists of all kinds, including black motorists who are stopped and searched because the smell of marijuana is in their car. It forecloses the possibility of arresting people for possession of marijuana, or unless you catch them red-handed selling it for sale. We're on the cusp, it seems, of legalizing sale, too. The irony, and I think we might be getting to this, though, is that although that will and has and will stand to reduce encounters between the police and people of color over marijuana, the people that stand to make the most money from the legalization of marijuana are huge corporations, right? Predominantly run by white Americans. It actually takes this thing that was happening in poorer communities and black communities that was under the scrutiny of the police and that was resulting in imprisonment, and it shifts it over to, frankly, to like Philip Morris, right? So I think that a whole new set of questions of distributive justice and fairness are just going to come and they'll play out in a really stark way that some people, I think, will find unacceptable. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you feel that there's anything that your own police department
Right.
can do to, I would say, to redress the balance of people of color being historically more targeted for drug arrests? Is there any kind of avenue we can go on that one, or is this kind of like it's already happened and we kind of have to move on?
It's interesting because I think it's a better question to ask nationally, and you're asking a complex question that has a lot to do with drug policy. It deserves an answer. So, first of all, the nation spent decades arresting black Americans for using drugs, for using crack, for using heroin. We've gotten away as a nation from a lot of the targeting of the users. Nonetheless, that was a change that happened when this opioid epidemic hit. And this opioid epidemic was an ocean of white users. It was very few black users. And we had this sudden change of heart. And I think that there was a lot of resentment in communities of color saying, now you're saying that you're reformed on this? And the test is going to be, for example, in Washington, D.C., the opioid deaths are going up, and they're going up among the population of black males in that community in their 40s and 50s. If they stay progressive in their approach, it'll show that the commitments are true. If they lapse back into arresting users, it shows that their values are in question. The last thing I'll say, though, is one of the focuses that we have, and I hope, I've worked with Brian and some of his colleagues on this issue, is one of our big focuses is helping people addicted to drugs. I'm not talking marijuana, I'm talking opioids, get treatment get treatment in prison if they're in prison, get treatment as an alternative to prison, get treatment before they need it, before they come into contact with criminal justice in a way that leads to trial. And we'd rather, if we're talking about not having to go after dealers as much, if we're talking about not having to target a population for selling drugs that is going to have an overrepresentation of Black Americans, one of the ways to do that is to reduce demand and reduce the acuteness of the epidemic by helping addicted people get treated. So it's not a perfect answer, but it is the focus of our approach right now.
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to go down that pathway a little bit further then. And how do you feel that it's best to reach people who need that help where they are?
Right.
What methods is Burlington Police doing to make sure that treatment is available, but also not stigmatized, and so people aren't afraid to?
No, that's a great question. And now we're talking about opioids. I know we were talking a bit about marijuana. I'll start by saying, like, we do, if somebody robs a marijuana dealer, there's like literally the way they do business is through competition, through robbery and violence. We act, right? But we're not making big cases against people, selling some weed or smoking some weed out of their house. We can, and who's in jail out of Burlington will attest to that. So there's two levels to that question. One is, as a police department working with Mayor Moreau Weinberger, what policies have we put in place that help reach people where they're at, and how have we used, the legitimacy of a police department and the messaging of a police department to advance those goals. And then the second question is, how do we do it at the individual street level? So at the big level, we've worked with Chittenden State's Attorney Sarah George to decriminalize, de facto, as a matter of our discretion, decriminalize the possession of treatment medication without a prescription. So if you don't know if you're ready for clinical treatment, but you want to try some of the medication, or you go in and out of a state of addiction and you just keep this medication handy, if you don't have a prescription, my police officers will not arrest you, not stigmatize you. We also cultivate a relationship of trust with the syringe exchange. You can ask the director, Grace Keller. We come when they call us, but we're not there to stigmatize. We're there to make the situation safe that they've called us for. We don't hang out outside looking to see who's coming and going to make drug cases. We don't make people feel unwelcome there. The police keep a healthy distance. And even when we're there, we're not stigmatizing about what we do. We also screen we're trying to, and screen every person we arrest for addiction. And if they need it, get them treatment. Right now, we're only doing a small percentage of that, but we're trying to ramp that up. And lastly, we were very, very integral in advocating for treatment in prison. So if you do something like a burglary or a robbery, and you end up getting incarcerated, and the root cause of that is addiction, we fought hard to make sure you get rehabilitation and treatment in prison. This is all a work in progress, but I think it's the right way to go, and we'll see if it helps. Thank you for listening. I know that was a long answer.
No, it was taking a little detour, but interesting nonetheless. Thank you. State Representative Chena, finally, looking back to our discussion today on reparations, and although you did say you're not quite sure how that would look at this point, with regards to the legalization of cannabis, do you believe profits from that industry or taxes that we'll bring in from that can be used to address these historic injustices in the Black community with regards to being targeted for drugs? And what would that look like to you if in a perfect world?
So you raise a good point, which is that if we indeed go through with taxation and regulation of cannabis, that we would be seeing new revenue that we haven't seen before in our state. There are a lot of problems with the finances of our society, our state, our nation, and there's a lot of, we're constantly scraping for new revenue and for trying to be creative about ways to fund all the things that we're doing without raising taxes. And there's going to be a big scramble if we start seeing new revenue from many people wanting a piece of the pie, so to speak, to use like a common phrase or whatever. Everyone's going to be, it's going to be like pigs at a trough, so yes, there will be some additional revenue. Whether or not that should be used for reparations, some might think yes, some might think no. I would ask that we give the reparations task force a chance to do their work and come forward with their recommendations about what needs to happen. And then we should look at how we're going to fund that regardless of the source. If we happen to have extra revenue from cannabis taxation, that might enable us to do some of that work. In fact, one might argue that now is the perfect time to do this work, because if there is additional revenue coming along, it might be that bubble might be just what we need to be able to accomplish, the recommendations of a task force and more. The reality is that revenue, if we're careful, could be used to invest in a lot of it can be used to invest in a lot of social programs and in a lot of changes in our society that could take care of people in better ways. Like, it could be used to start universal health care. It could be used to start a state bank. It could be used to create stronger reserves. It could be used to invest in state pensions. Like, there's all kinds of things. But I do think one noble use for the money could be to invest in programs that address systemic racism.
And with regards to some of the other areas you're talking about in terms of what we could do with that money, would you argue, or could you argue, that those programs themselves address racism in a way? For example, universal universal healthcare. If those are economically disadvantaged, which affects black communities more often than white, would take a burden off financially people of color. Wouldn't that go away to kind of address these issues?
I do think that investments in social programs would be one way of providing reparations towards people of color, people of African descent. But I think they actually go further. I think that investing in the right social programs provide reparations for anyone who's been exploited by our society. I mean, working class people have been exploited by corporations for a long, long time as well. Indigenous people in Vermont have been disenfranchised and discriminated against and had, so much taken away from them. I could go on. Investing in social programs is a way to provide reparations for anyone who has faced social injustice. And if done the right way, we could actually level the playing field and set a path forward for everyone to have equal opportunity in the future. So,
well, that's about all we've got time for. Thank you guys so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. We'll be inviting you back at some point, I'm sure. Sure. Before I go, I'd like to talk about our sustaining memberships. So you can help us grow and win by becoming a sustaining member with Rights and Democracy. And this will help us push for progressive values all over Vermont and New Hampshire. So please visit our website at radvt.org or radnh.org and maybe pledge a few dollars here and there, and you can really help us continue what we're doing. Once again, thank you guys so much for joining me today, and thank you for watching at home or on the internet. You can also stream this online at a later date. We'll be seeing you again next month when we'll be on the 31st of May. Until then, good evening.